All right, so we're in the home stretch here. I'm Mohana Ravindranath. I am Stats Bay Area Health Tech Correspondent. It's a real pleasure to be here to moderate this conversation, and you can really feel the concentration of knowledge and brain power in this room, so I really appreciate being here. I actually think that research is kind of the perfect way to end this conversation because it ties in all these elements of vulnerable populations, frameworks, bias, all these things that we've already talked about. So I'm really excited to sort of tie it all together. I would also encourage you as the audience to jump in with questions. I don't want to leave it till the end. I'm hoping this can be a very sort of dynamic conversation. So I want to start by asking my panelists here to just go down the line and introduce themselves and talk very briefly about how they relate, sort of what their role is in AI-enabled research, and then we can jump into some more questions about what that means.
Okay, well, looks like I'm kicking this off. It's so wonderful to be here. My name is Sylvia Plevritis, and I'm professor and chair of biomedical data science. This is a department in the School of Medicine that really, I would say, is kind of an AI enabling department because we develop the tools that across the entire biomedical spectrum to do AI discovery-based research in basic science, in clinical decision making, and then really our faculty do think about the implementation and evaluation of those tools. And so we have a graduate program that we run where we have master's and PhD students. My own work, I hope to talk a little bit more later, is more on basic sciences and understanding more of the molecular biology, for example, of cancer, to think about how to improve decision making and how we use AI in that translation.
Hi, I'm Peter Lee. I work at Microsoft where I lead the research division, which is called Microsoft Research. We've been, of course, collaborating very closely with a number of companies, most notably OpenAI, for the last several years on generative AI systems. And some of that has been very focused on the potential impacts on certain areas of human endeavor, most notably medicine. In addition to that, we've become very interested with especially the next generation of models that are coming in the potential impact that they might have in facilitating or accelerating scientific discovery in various fields. And so we'll probably get into a little bit of that. Today, of course, there is sort of facilitation to understand data a little bit better, but the idea of generative AI systems that might actually be more than just a helpful intern in the work of a scientific researcher, but actually a partner in that discovery process is something that we find extremely interesting today.
Thank you. Well, it's great to be here. My name is Jess Mega. I'm a cardiologist, and my career has always been at the intersection of technology, life science, and healthcare. And I'm particularly excited that we're talking about research today, because as a clinician, even years ago, it was very evident to me that we can practice the best medicine, but the only way we get new tools into the hands of clinicians and patients is through research. And in my opinion, it's where we're going to be able to have the most innovative models because we have a testing framework. And so we'll talk about that today, but this is, I think, where we can try some of these big, bold ideas that then ultimately translate. In terms of prior work, I worked as a clinical trialist and worked in genomics for many years. That led me to working with multidimensional data, came out to Silicon Valley about 9 years ago, co-founded Verily, which is a branch of Alphabet focused on life science and healthcare, and now get to work with the Stanford community, continuing to scale digital health. So again, I think research is an incredibly hot area, and I look forward to our discussion.
I want to start by talking a bit about what the opportunity is here and where you see AI making an impact on medical research today. So I'm wondering if we can get really granular here. When you talk about this kind of AI-guided discovery or AI-based discovery, what does that mean? And can we connect it to some of the other things that people mentioned earlier, like that N of 1 kind of research? What becomes possible today? And maybe we can go down the line again.
Well, happy to kick us off. That's a great question. We're seeing AI applied across the entire biomedical spectrum. So we have talked a lot today about clinical AI, and I would say most of the focus is what's in EPIC, in the EHR. But you can also, and we are doing this work, on other augmented data that goes into clinical records, such as a radiology image, the whole slide image from pathology, even the sequencing data on, for example, biospecimens. So there are there is a multimodal data set that we're really working with now. And we're at a frontier now, thanks to a lot of fantastic innovation with multimodal data, to think about how to put multimodal clinical data together. And so I would say that's a super exciting space. But just to amplify that a little bit more, on the molecular side, we here at Stanford collect biospecimens every day and take them into our labs and do deep molecular assays. And so the thinking there is that we're actually seeing foundation models that are more biological, because this molecular data is very structured, as language is and clinical data is. And so there's tremendous activity to even think about the central dogma of biology, the relationship between DNA, RNA, and protein. And so while that's happening simultaneously, and we're looking at clinical specimens, this idea of really linking the bench and the bedside is very exciting. So I'll just leave my comments at that for now. Thank you.
Yeah, fantastic stuff. It's not only bedside and bench getting connected, but bedside, back office, bench, and there's increasingly, I think, tighter connection. There are sort of 4 stages. The most mundane thing for me right now, leading Microsoft Research, I get sent new research manuscripts and drafts several times a day. I feel an obligation to keep up with the research in our labs around the world, but it's really, today, it's just impossible. And so I cheat and I use GPT-4 to read those research papers and summarize them for me. So that's a very basic thing. But it's actually incredibly useful. And it helps me maintain the discipline that maybe I was capable of maintaining on my own 15 years ago, but at age 63 I am not. And so it just really is very, it's extended my longevity as an active research leader for a large research organization. The second level, which has me very excited, is just the use of generative AI to understand data, derive possible structure, and then actually create the code to parse that data into that structure. And one of the most impressive examples I've seen of that is from Epic with their Sidekick system integrated into their Cosmos database, which uses GPT-4. And basically, it's able to just look at the understanding of the data, both from the documentation as well as data samples, derive structure, and then act as your personal data scientist, writing, converting queries like, tell me about trends in RSV into appropriate SQL or database retrieval commands, and then setting up the very complicated, overly complicated parameters for visualizing that retrieved data. We've done some work, and we've been very impressed with the work going on at the Providence Health System on clinical trials triaging. Again, just looking at unstructured clinical notes using GPT-4 to derive structure from largely unstructured data. What is super exciting right now and very, very active, I know it's very active here at Stanford, it's very active at Microsoft Research, it's very active at DeepMind, many labs around the world, is predicting structure and dynamics of physical systems, most notably small molecules. And that is just progressing so fast right now. And I think in much less than 3 years, maybe in less than 2 years, it's going to be just standard practice in all forms of biological, biotech, R&D, as well as biopharma R&D and product development. And then the fourth stage, which I find really the most alluring, is just in AI that is understanding the whole life cycle of scientific discovery and research. Everything from the mundane things of rewriting an IND based on an analysis of the results of the last round of experimentation to actually doing that analysis. And so those 4 stages, I think, starts from the very, very mundane cheat of just having something help you read your research papers and maybe write them all the way to the discovery.
Well, I, for one, am happy to know that I'm not the only person using the summarization tools.
Me too.
So I'll talk about 2 tangible examples. One is, if we look at AI-generated tools, even in the last year, there are 139 applications that went to the FDA that now have approved clinical applications. Now, it's important for us to think about many of those are actually known signals. So tools that help us detect, for example, atrial fibrillation, which is a known cardiac condition, or tools that help us look at an ultrasound or an X-ray. And so it is very tangible where we see products moving forward. On the other hand, and I think this is where the most exciting work is going to come from a research perspective, is what is the unknown? And so a lot of times in research and medicine, we rely on our own ability to either see, observe, hear, smell. But there are cases now where we're using AI, as you just heard, to look for new drug compounds, for example, to look at an antibody and how it relates to a protein. And within the last year, there's really interesting work, particularly in the field of antibiotics, which many people had shied away, said there's certain areas, for example, MRSA, which is a resistant strain, we're not going to be able to drug that target. Well, guess what? Using the creative exploratory power, even sometimes what we call the hallucinations that we get, that actually was very advantageous to look for new ways of targeting. And there's work being done at Stanford there. The other area that's very tangible is looking at hyperspectral imaging. So this is looking way beyond what the human eye can visualize, but now using AI to detect patterns, for example, in pathology slides, which normally we would have someone look at the slides themselves. So I think that's where, if you ask kind of tangibly where the future is going, in my sense, it's this opportunity to see the unknown. So to summarize, there are today 139 new applications for known signals, but I just encourage people to continue to push for the unknown, because I think everyone here knows someone who is suffering with a health condition that needs something beyond what we can offer today.
So when we're talking about things like drug therapies, how does the involvement of AI change the translation of research to implementation, or getting drugs out there? And we heard about an algorithm earlier that they were only able to detect a certain element of it after it had been tested on patients, or sort of tested in sort of a real world environment. And so I'm just wondering if you can talk about sort of new benchmark hurdles that AI guided research or AI enabled research might have to pass before it actually gets to the patient. And I guess one of the elements of that would be sort of to what extent we can eradicate bias sort of before it reaches the patient.
Okay, I get to go first.
We'll break it up, we promise. We'll be spontaneous soon.
You're happy? If you want to start, I'm fine. Yeah.
All right, let's spice it up.
Okay.
So I am a recovering clinical trialist. I guess I never actually fully recovered, but I'm from the old school application where we would do, and I'm going to talk about the clinical trial process just to kind of think about some tangible examples. So typically in cardiovascular medicine, when you run clinical trials, you may work with 1,000 sites in 40 different countries. This can be an incredibly laborious process. Somewhere, if you look at the amount of money that goes into a typical drug, you're talking about between $500 million and $1 billion. That is untenable as we think about scaling research. So tangibly, in terms of where we've seen AI expedite the clinical research process, one is you can now look and start to simulate what your trial would look like based on data that is in clinicaltrials.gov. That data is living there. You can think about what the event rate may look like. What was the event rates that people saw 10 years ago, 20 years? So you're starting to run simulations even before you started to drug the first patient. Another place that we're seeing acceleration is actually understanding doses among different populations. So again, there's a lot of pharmacokinetic data, pharmacodynamic data, but it has lived in silos. So you're seeing better dose selection up front. The other piece is from a patient perspective. Unfortunately, in some clinical trials, up to 40% of patients stop their medicine. We now have ways of starting to detect whether someone is likely to stop their medicine based on if they're missing certain appointments. So it's looking around the corner. And then finally, and I'll tell an example that I had to live with, there are many, many sites, as I mentioned, 1,000 different sites out there. We had one site where, as it turns out, the patient was fraudulent. So they had one patient that represented 100 patients in the trial. Nowadays, you can use anomaly detection, not 100% source document verification, which means a physical person has to go to a site. But you can use all of these tools to start to expedite the entire clinical trials process. So I think when you step back, there is going to be an acceleration in research in general, which just makes therapies more available.
Yeah, maybe one thing, if you haven't had this experience, go to a GPT-4 class model. So I'll push the ones that, of course, we're working on with OpenAI. So you can access that through ChatGPT, and there's a new model as of yesterday, GPT-4o, or copilot.microsoft.com. I'm not trying to sell our products, but these are the GPT-4 class models, and these are free for use for anyone, and use Copilot in creative mode, and they'll both access the same model. Now, go to a data set site. So clinicaltrials.gov is a good place. I typically recommend the World Health Organization's data website. Download a data set, maybe infant mortality data set from the WHO, and download that as a CSV file onto your laptop. If you take a look at that data, it's a lot of data, and it's awful. Has missing fields, has mistyped fields, it's a mess. And then just tell GPT-4o, I have some data that I've downloaded, I'd like to analyze and visualize it. And then engage in that dialogue. It'll ask you to upload that file from your laptop. And the first thing it'll try to do is understand the data. And it'll quickly discover that the data is crappy. And it'll start writing some code to try to fix it. And it'll fail over and over and over again. But it'll review those failures and keep trying it. And 9 times out of 10 in that process, it'll eventually figure out how to clean up that data, and then start to analyze it, answer your questions, draw up pretty visualizations, and so on. It's just an experience that, if you haven't had it, is a hint at what's coming into the future. It's something that's working now, but is a hint of an everyday thing that scientists and researchers are doing. And now just try to project as the logical and mathematical reasoning of these systems starts to improve, as new modalities that are very specific to your domain of research in biomedicine start to get integrated, and just try to project ahead as to what might be coming, and it'll give you a little bit of an intuition about what the future could be.
Yeah, that's fantastic. The ability of these tools to really structure that unstructured data and to fill in the gaps so that we can do learning on top of them is, I think, going to be an amazing enabler for discovery for sure. But to your question about these drugs and how is all this going to help us, I would add that there are drug combinations that we don't really understand that we should be putting together. And these tools are now enabling us to think about which drugs to put in combinations, what are potential toxicities of these combinations. And so I think that, instead of just, it's impossible to run trials to test every combination, and we saw that with immunotherapy. And so we are getting to a point now where with this rich molecular data, we're really trying to understand the impact of drugs on tissues and their cell-cell communication, toxicity at the tissue level and more systemic levels. And so without getting into a lot of specifics, there are technologies now that are supplementing tissue analysis with spatial biology and really deep molecular profiling of tissues and sort of their spatially aware transcriptome, proteome, metabolome. And these are really enabling us to understand the impact of drugs, for example, drugs that target cancer, but not only on the cancer cells, but the tissue around the cancer cells, and how cells that circulate around the body are also collected through bloodstreams and sampling into some places in the body. They're bringing such a rich amount of data to understand really the dynamic and systemic behavior of drugs, in our system with technologies and data sets that we haven't had before, and then infrastructure to put them together in ways that we haven't had before.
Just listening here, there are two things, two difficult issues that I wanted to raise. One is I find, as a techie myself, living and working in a technology company, that technologists, this is an awful stereotype, but as a general matter, technologists do not respect the incredible complexity of human biology. So there's a tendency to believe that once we have nailed the modeling of the structure and dynamics of small molecules, that we've solved biology. I'm being a little over dramatic, but there's a strong element of truth to that. And I would say for the work that we do within Microsoft Research, this is a constant battle. That we just really, that there's so much more. All of the omics, for example, the huge complexity of the chain reaction of chemical processes that takes place once, let's say, a docking event occurs, and so on, is just not really grasped within the technology community, and yet the technology community has an ability to just dazzle anyone, even the experts, and so there's a danger there that I just am hoping that there are louder voices to really challenge and bridge that gap. And then you mentioned about biases, and there's a huge debate in the computer science community about whether biases can be mitigated in AI systems. I'm deeply pessimistic about that myself, for the same reasons that I'm pessimistic that biases can be eliminated or mitigated from any human being. But it is also, I think, quite true that AI systems will be extremely powerful tools for spotting and combating biased decision-making when it's made by humans or AI systems. So it's a complex equation in the same way that it is with humans.
Yeah, and really to almost double-click on that, this idea that you need broad groups of populations coming together, technologists, clinicians, designers, ethicists, and I think that's so emblematic of the room that you all have brought together today. It's interesting, I was teaching a drug development course yesterday, and this came up where, this idea that we may make, and I'm going to use this word, it's not accidental, we're going to make better guesses at what might work, because right now only 1 in 7 clinical development programs actually go on, and these are programs that are already starting in phase 1 and 2 clinical design. So I think your point about, yes, we may find a better target, or we think about it, use the example of antibiotics, it gives us more opportunity, but we still have to go through that same testing products. And anyone who's been in the clinical trials world, I think maybe has been appropriately humbled. A great example is we know that HDL high levels are actually advantageous overall from epidemiologic studies, but there were large clinical development programs where everyone was sure that CETP inhibitors that raised HDL would save people's lives, and there actually were off-target effects, and it actually led to higher mortality. So I think combining this optimism around better guessing with the reality of what clinical testing looks like is just an opportunity everyone in this room has to do together. So I just want to say I cannot emphasize that more, optimism and reality.
Do we have any questions in the audience?
Hi, I'm Lisa Lehman. Thank you so much for your insightful comments, and I share your excitement and optimism about research in this space. I'm curious, and I want to bring us back to the concept of responsibility, and I'm curious to know two things. One, if you think that the research ethics frameworks that we have, really grounded in the Belmont Report that was published in 1979 with 3 principles, right, of respect for persons, beneficence, and justice, are actually sufficient for this new era of, or this new space of AI research. So that's one question, and actually maybe 3 questions related to that. If not, then what else do we need? And then I'm curious what what are the research ethics frameworks that you're using at Microsoft Research or in the other spaces where you're taking AI and applying it in the research world? What's actually happening in practice? Thank you.
I guess I have to go first this time. I really appreciate the question. We've tried our level best to publish as openly and transparently as possible our overall approach, both philosophically in the principles around responsible AI, and in fact, just recently we published a much more detailed, what we call a transparency report. I don't like the name transparency report because computer scientists, when they think transparency, they think about open source and open weights and so on. But the transparency report was really detailing, in almost excruciating detail, the specific steps, the guardrails and ethical guidelines that govern how we conduct our research in AI, as well as the internal governance structure. Having said that, that in itself does not give a useful framework for developing an ethics around AI and AI-enabled research. And I don't know what that should be. I simply don't. But let me just express some optimism and cut us all in this room a little bit of slack on this. Because it's really been just only about a year. And what I see going on in the world in just a year is, first off, there was a recent count well over 100 major articles involving generative AI published in the leading medical journals in the last 13 months. A huge fraction of the world's most brilliant minds in the field thinking hard about these ethical issues. And in fact, I think in my lifetime, the only thing comparable to this was at the completion of the mapping of the human genome, when very, very serious thought was given early on in the ethical considerations and the safety issues around the prospect of genetic engineering. And out of that thought process emerged the field of bioethics. And bioethics had existed before then, but bioethics really took off then. As an academic discipline, I think has really contributed a foundation and set of frameworks for regulation, for codes of conduct and the like. So I personally choose to be very optimistic at this point. I mean, heck, this whole symposium is addressing this with a lot of incredibly brilliant people, and it's only been a year. So I don't know the answer in specifics to your question, but I think the right things are happening.
Yeah, and Lisa, thanks for the question. I'm so glad you brought it up, because I think the frameworks we've used thus far are helpful, but not fully sufficient. And so the piece that keeps me up at night in terms of obviously being quite optimistic, when we came to the idea of drug discovery or devices, we had a general sense of some of the off-target effects. But I think here we are just starting to understand not just there's the cause of a given intervention, and then there's all the unexpected downstream effects. And, it's a shout out, there's Zainab who's here, Garbasani is someone who I've been fortunate enough to work with, and she's starting to engage with many broader populations than we ever did when it came to traditional research, where we know that there's just an under-discovery and under-evaluation of certain populations. So I think we're going to have to get ahead of these off-target effects, which may mean that we're treating populations differently. The other thing is there are investments here at Stanford that are starting to look at that. So the Centers of Digital Health, which is very synergistic to the work that's going on here today, just released pilot grants that are specifically a call to think about what kind of ethical frameworks we need. So I would just say what we have is not sufficient, but I'm encouraged to see particularly investigators in the room here today who are focusing on it.
So I'd like to add maybe a slightly different perspective. I think one of the issues that drives the ethics is really the black box nature of these tools. We really don't fully understand how they work, And that's different than the AI we had for decades. We really understood how it worked. We could quantify its uncertainty. It was explainable. We understood what parameters were driving decisions, even if the performance wasn't great. We could drill down into what was going on. Now we have tools that we don't understand. They're not explainable. We can't quantify uncertainty. And we have to recognize that that's a space we're working in. So as we have these discussions about ethics and responsibility, we have to recognize those limitations in those discussions that we didn't have before. And so how are we going to deal with them? And I think that's an important also aspect to consider. You know, from my perspective as somebody who is running an academic department, I want to put out into the world like the best trained students and researchers that are going to understand how to use these tools. But we're not fully resourced to do that, right? Our students aren't using, you know, billion and trillion parameter models. We're not working on the world's data. And so until that becomes accessible, I think we're always going to be struggling, because if that access is only given to a limited few, we're going to be really steeped into this question very deeply.
There's so many more questions to ask, but I guess I do want to end on this note about equity and how to make sure that these tools are as accessible as possible to a diverse set of sort of investigators. And I'm just wondering what steps you recommend taking or that you are taking to sort of zip up that disparity.
Well, first off, we've tried to create the financially sustainable conditions to enable our most powerful models that are deemed safe enough for broad deployment to be available to everyone. And so, in fact, we finally accomplished that with the GPT-4 class models, with the release of GPT-4 4.0 and into the free tiers of ChatGPT and Microsoft Copilot. And so at least we've created the financial stability where that can be done completely without a financial barrier beyond needing digital access. I think there's a second question about which has to do with this transparency, like how can we understand what these things are? And in the computer science community, that oftentimes centers around the concept of open source. Can we open up the source code? Source code for AI systems is complicated. There's the code itself, which is actually very small, just a few pages. There are the model weights. The model weights are routinely now, except for the very frontier models, are released openly by a number of builders of these systems. And I think they'll be released more openly even at the frontier once we get past election years and other things that are making governments very nervous. But the real open source, which no one has really done except for the Allen Institute, is training data. But that training data ends up being previously disclosed sets of data. And so it ends up not being that informative. Ultimately, what we're finding is that even when people have access to these things, it doesn't actually increase that transparency. It's as impenetrable for many of the questions that we want to answer as any psychiatric examination of a human being. And so there is some deep problem here where the kinds of things that we as researchers have wanted to understand about these systems is really elusive just due to the sheer complexity of these systems. And so exactly how we confront and deal with this is really one of the most fundamental questions. I personally believe that the world needs a little bit of time to become comfortable with these technologies before, for example, governments would be comfortable with a company like Microsoft, releasing weights to the world. That comfort just does not exist. Governments expect us to make sure that these things don't fall into the wrong hands. Whether those dangers are valid or not, the perception of those dangers being valid is very real, and so there are limits to the amount that can be disclosed.
And maybe a comment and a call to action. We heard earlier a great example of a product that needed to be implemented in the healthcare system to actually see how it was performing. So I think one comment is the more we get these particular tools into the real systems, the more we'll understand how they actually work. So that leads to my call to action. When you think about a new medicine or a new device, companies aren't just putting them out into the world. There's a huge public-private partnership that is required. We then collaboratively go to the FDA, EMEA, to get these products evaluated. And we may not be able to understand every single weight. That may be something that is not disclosed. But if these are AI-generated tools that are going to impact our patients in this way that some of these interventions would, then we as a clinical community need to partner with companies that are developing the tools. Now, it's not to say there are places where we can move quickly. We had a lot of examples this morning where we don't want everything to go through our standard approval processes. But when we have the opportunities and the risks in the way we have with other products, we have a framework out there. And so it's just a call to action to say, let's just all stay engaged and create these public-private partnerships to make sure we're helping patients.
All right, I think that's all we have time for. Thank you so much. And I'd like to invite Dean Lloyd Minor back to the stage.